David and Kathryn Pearce live in the UK. David's first preaching trip to Russia was in 1994, followed the year later in 1995 to the Ukraine and then to Kazakhstan in 2003. David and Kathryn have continued their preaching work in Eastern Europe, making around 4 trips every year for Bible schools and welfare visits. And in 1998 they implemented the Cherith parcel scheme in the UK that sends around 400 parcels a year from UK brothers and sisters to Christadelphian families in Eastern Europe. David and Kathryn talk about their experiences in the past and the changes that are happening at the moment in the UK. I welcome them to the Wilderness Conversation. David and Kathryn, thanks very much for joining Wilderness Conversations.
Thank you.
A pleasure to be with you.
David, you were born in 1940, which was right at the start of the Second World War in the UK. What do you remember of your early childhood?
Well, I was actually born in Scotland, of all places. My father happened to be working there when the war broke out. And so that was on the west coast of Scotland. But we came down to Northampton in England when I was about 3, because my father had been working in a factory that was making explosives for the coal industry. It's a mining area in Scotland where we were living. And when the war broke out, that was turned to munitions. As a Christadelphian, of course, he felt he couldn't carry on doing that. So we moved to Northampton. I really grew up in Northampton. Don't remember much of the war itself because, we were around the age of 5 or so when the war ended. I do remember going into an air raid shelter in one of our neighbours' gardens and seeing the planes going overhead and being terrified. Because there were very few bombs actually fell on Northampton at that time. It wasn't a particularly an area where there's lots of useful factories, so we were spared in that sense. Yeah, so I grew up in a country school in Boughton in Northampton, walking to and fro every day to school through the woods and along the paths. Our school teacher was very keen on nature and used to take us for nature walks, and we had aquariums in the classroom, that kind of thing. So it got me interested in agriculture, really, and that became my career eventually.
You mentioned your father was a Christadelphian, so you grew up in a Christadelphian home.
Yes. Actually, my great-grandfather and great-grandmother were Christadelphian. That goes back 3 generations. So about the 18, they were born about 1860, and they become some of the earliest Christadelphians in the UK.
What was it like growing up as a young person back in those days? I'm guessing sort of early or late 1950s, early 1960s. What sort of things did you do? What was life like in the UK then?
Well, from 1950 onwards, 1951, we actually moved to Rugby, which is a nearby town. And I went to the grammar school, the local grammar school, where we learned Latin, for example, and it's quite unusual nowadays, and French as foreign languages. Got very interested in science and biology at school. Those years passed quite quickly. Actually, one of the brothers at rugby meeting started on the same day at school with me, and he's still around today, Alan Clark. So we're still good friends. I went all through school together. My first wife, Pat, actually flew from Holland to the UK at the age of about 18 and ended up living with a brother and sister who are friends of mine quite close by. And her father and mother were working in Holland, so she was with them for several years and then decided it was very lonely for a Christadelphian girl out there. There weren't any other young people. So she came back to the UK, flew to Cannock Chase, which is quite close to where I lived, and we bumped into each other there. So we fell in love and we got married in 1962 and started our families in 1964, had 4 children eventually. Unfortunately, she died when she got to the age of 60. Which was very suddenly and rather sadly.
How old were the children then when Pat died?
Well, the children were all grown up and had their own children, except for I had 9 grandchildren by that time, 9 grandchildren when she died. But the youngest of them were only quite young. And then, tragically, only 5 months later, my oldest daughter died from the same cause. It was a cerebral hemorrhage that caught them both. So I lost my wife and my oldest daughter together. And she died, leaving a little girl of only 3, and they were very, very tiny children. So we had tragedies. Yeah, we've had tragedies, but I've always felt in life you have to look forward when things happen and not backwards, and try and press on towards the kingdom.
So the comfort of the scriptures would have been very important for you.
Yeah. Now, the way I met Kathryn was very unusual because being rather sad after losing my first wife, I was at the meeting at Cambridge at that time. We were living in Cambridge. And a young brother from Cambridge was going to get married to a sister in Australia. And so he said to me, well, look, why don't you come to the wedding? He said, I'll invite you to the wedding in Australia. So I thought, oh, yeah, a good idea. Get away from it all, you know. So we fixed it all up, got the tickets. And actually, I knew Kathryn in Australia was a great traveller. So I actually emailed Kathryn and said, look, I'm coming to Australia for a fortnight. I've got the wedding to do, but after the wedding, I've got a fortnight. Can you sort out some sort of travel program for me in Australia? I'd like to go and see the reef, for example, and Adelaide and so on. So she fixed it all up for me by email. And then, only the week before the wedding, it was cancelled.
Oh.
They decided not to get married after all. So, well, I thought, having spent all the money on the tickets, I'll go ahead. So we went to Sydney, which is where the plane comes in from England. And Kathryn met me at the airport in Sydney, and we just fell in love. It just went click like that.
That's a great story. So a wedding was cancelled and a wedding resulted.
And we've been together ever since, which is now, coming up to 16 years.
Kathryn, where were you born and where did you grow up?
I was going to say, just before we go on to that, the funny thing was that the first person we saw after we were together was a brother from the UK who was meant to be the best man at that same wedding. So he was also out in Australia at a bit of a loose end because he had his tickets bought, and we bumped into him at the Manly Corso and we said, come and have an ice cream with us, and we got chatting and it was fine. I was born in Sydney at the Bethesda Hospital in Marrickville, and my parents, brother Ian and sister Val Newer, and they lived in Bass Hill, and my father has now passed away, but my mum still lives in the same house that my dad built. My connection with Sydney goes back right to the start, and basically I went to the local Bass Hill schools, and then I began work as a secretary first in a insurance broker. I did a couple of months temp work in Perth, so I lived over there for a few months and got to know a few of the Christadelphians there and some good friends there, even from back that time. And when I got to about the age of 18, I was baptised, and then from there I was continually working in different companies, but then I said to the company that I was at, were there any other opportunities? And they said, actually, no, there isn't here. But if you were to go to the London office, you could get some work now that you have your extra certificate.
Oh, that's a great opportunity.
Yeah, so I decided to make a change of scene. I left Sydney when I was about 31, I think it was. And it was good to have a change of scene. A lot of the other young people in the Sydney Christadelphian youth group had married by now.
Yep.
And here I was still single. And as many singles will know, you can attend activities, you might say religiously, for years and not meet the right person. And you do need to make changes of friendship, and you're obviously on different paths after a while with your peers. So I moved to London and I became a member of the London Ealing Ecclesia. It was a very transient type of ecclesia. There was the core membership who had been there for a very long time, but then there was a lot of other people coming and going all the time. So every Sunday we had new people who would come into Heathrow travelling or thinking of moving there, not sure how long they would live there. So and initially I found it strange because people were always asking me, where are you from and how long are you here for? And I got a bit tired of saying, well, I'm here on an ancestry visa and I'm going to be here for quite a while because my grandparents were born here. Three out of my four grandparents were either born in England or Scotland. And then as I was there a bit longer, I realised there's so many people coming and going that the core members were actually trying to work out whether it was worth investing some time in me because, I might be just there for a week and then not come back. So It was a very transient place.
I've been to London a couple of times. I've only ever been to the meeting once there. You won't be surprised to hear that it was the Ealing Ecclesia I made the effort to go to. And for me, it was on the train line. So when I was staying in London, you jump on the train and you can go there. So it just seemed to be the obvious ecclesia to go to.
It's actually very easy to get there. And so anyone coming to London would get a big welcome there for sure.
What ecclesial environment did you grow up in Sydney?
Initially, I was at Lakemba Ecclesia, and then we belonged to Punchbowl for a while. And I also belonged to Beverly Hills Ecclesia. I was a child when that was formed. Did quite a lot of preaching as an ecclesia and brought in quite a few people from non-Christadelphian backgrounds. And so I think that was a real positive of that sort of, you might say, era. And then I belonged to Shaftesbury Road Ecclesia for a while. And then when I came over, I was at London Ealing. And then once I met David, I joined the Cambridge meeting where he was a member.
Well, one fascinating thing in England at the moment is the huge numbers of Iranians who are being baptised.
Yes.
You know, we now have over 1,000 Iranian brothers and sisters in the UK.
1,000?
Yes.
1 in 10 Christadelphians in the UK was born in Iran.
Yeah.
And these are young people. They're like between the ages of 20 and 40. They're people who battled their way across Europe, sometimes taking years, managed to get to the UK. And they mostly came from a background where they were either Muslim or Christian. And so when the Christadelphians only believe in one God, that's a big thing for them. We don't believe in a Trinity.
Right.
So that's a big help. And so as soon as they get into the UK,
by various means,
they're met by friends who have already become connected with the Christadelphians in one way or another. And so the numbers are huge. And we've had more baptisms last year than any year in history of the Christadelphians in the UK.
Yeah.
In the UK.
That's extraordinary. I had no
Immense
idea.
Yeah.
And in London, it's 1 in 5
Yeah.
is an Iranian.
And all these people have to be taught because we don't baptise them until they've been properly instructed and they've been examined to make sure they know the fundamentals.
Yeah.
And then they're baptised. So they're all very, very keen. And one of the things we're told by them is they just love being loved. Coming to a place where there's a family, Christadelphians, and put their arms around them.
Yeah, and help them.
And help them and welcome them. Yeah. They're so overwhelmed by that experience of love.
Yeah, and many of them would say they've never experienced that ever in their lives,
own country,
because of all the fear and persecution and things that they have suffered. And they just get amazed when they get amongst a group of Christadelphians just how friendly and normal we are
with each other.
And they just find that, and it's exactly what Jesus says, isn't it? If you have love one for another, people will know it's the gospel.
People will want to join you.
So it's kind of feeling it's...
Islam really is a very austere kind of religion where God's somewhere out there and you're very frightened of him. So as long as you keep your 5 prayers a day up and go the Ramadan, you'll be okay.
The 5
the idea of a father who actually loves you like children.
So how are you accommodating them? Are they dispersing across the Christadelphian ecclesial world, or do they tend to congregate in one area? Or
No.
When they first come to the UK as refugees, the government puts them into hostels.
Temporary accommodation.
Until they've had a tribunal. They have to go past a tribunal to see if they can have permission to stay permanently, or whether they must be sent back to Iran or some other country. So they have to wait for that tribunal. Meanwhile, they have to live in this hostel in fairly primitive conditions. They're given a small amount of money by the government each week for food and
for tiny things. They get their food supplied, actually.
It's pretty hard, really. When they come back, some are very rich people back in Iran. Some of them are doctors and teachers and managers, well-educated people. So they really have to struggle when they first get here. But they endure all that because they know at the end, if they get permission to stay, then they'll
be able to live normally.
A stable background to live in a relatively peaceful country.
The strange thing that's happening is because the government is moving them around, and often with not very much notice, they get moved quickly somewhere else because there's a constant stream of new people coming across by boats every day. There's boats coming across from Calais and other places. And so the government is having to quickly move them on to other parts of the country to free up the accommodation for others, yeah? So they can typically be in ecclesia for, say, 6 months, but then get moved somewhere else. And they're getting very good at networking amongst the different ecclesias to find their new Christadelphians that can be their new family, you might say. So they're very adaptable, and because of lockdown, they're very keen to actually come into the hall in person so they can actually see people, because in the daily life, they're just in their single room on their own, or perhaps in a room with a dormitory type accommodation, you know, and they want to see people in person and make friendships, of course. But the difficulty is that not all the ecclesias in the UK have them. So some ecclesias haven't had any, and others have had more than 100. So some of the ecclesias in London, for instance, one in particular, had a membership of about 20 and about 100 Iranians. So that small ecclesia had to actually start their own food bank just to help the Iranians that were coming. And, of course, many of them, once they're baptised, they're obviously telling their friends and others, and so that the numbers are growing exponentially.
It snowballs, yeah.
So for the average Christadelphian, if you're in a small ecclesia where you haven't had any visitors come on a Sunday night after doing years of public lectures, now to have 20 or 30 people come who can't speak English, that's been really difficult.
I was going to ask you about the language. Do they come across with some English or very little?
Some have English, some were even English teachers in Iran, so they're
all different.
They're well ahead, and they become translators for the others.
Yeah.
But the language Farsi that they speak, the Iranian language, is very rare in the UK. We don't, not the language you learn at school, like French and German. So there's very few people who understand it. And really, there's a big pressure on them to learn English because they can't really find work in the UK unless they can actually speak English. So they have to learn English eventually. But at the moment, we work with translators, and they in some meetings now, they have to do dual exhortations, which you speak it in English, a few phrases, it's translated into Farsi, a few more phrases, it's translated again.
For the average Christadelphian who perhaps has never done mission work, the mission work is actually coming to their ecclesia.
Yeah, that's amazing, isn't it?
Now they've got Iranians
on
coming
the
to their ecclesia, very keen to learn.
Asking to be taught.
So, you know, the brothers, some brothers and sisters are absolutely exhausted trying to help all these people learn. And that's the other thing that's been amazing, is when these Iranians have been shifted to other areas because the government's moved them on, is they're obviously starting to notice differences between different ecclesias, different styles, different personalities. But also, one thing that's been really good is so far, the level of teaching has been consistent amongst the different meetings, even though they're all taking their own sorts of different approaches. So that's been really good, because for them to integrate into the next ecclesia, they obviously have to learn and believe the same things as what we do. And actually, some of the brothers that do the interviews have been amazed at the level of Bible knowledge some of these people already had when they were back in Iran.
Right.
That they were secretly studying the Bible for themselves, and they're just simply looking for a group that believes what they already believed.
You've mentioned some of the effects on the ecclesia. How would you describe sort of the ecclesial world in the UK as a result of this?
It's going through a bit of a revolution, really.
Yeah.
For years and years, we've been preaching to English people, and they've not been interested. Nobody comes.
Sunday night lectures.
You hold your Sunday night lectures, and nobody ever comes.
And everyone gets all disappointed.
So suddenly to have people who want to be taught on your doorstep,
shock, really.
It's quite a shock. Yes.
Yeah, a pleasant shock.
It's taking some adjustment. It's a bit like, I suppose, in the first century when Jewish brothers and sisters had to get used to Gentiles being baptised and coming to join them on a Sunday morning. It's a bit like that.
Yeah.
Clinging to the traditions of not being too willing to change to a new system to accommodate these new people.
I suppose we all think of the ecclesia as our bit of oasis, don't we? We like to go there on a Sunday and kind of relax and enjoy.
Be comfortable.
We have this oasis, but then if you might say too many of these other people come, then it's going to change the ethos. because perhaps one of the readings is going to be in Farsi and the other one's going to be in English. And for some people, that's a shock, you know. So they've got to do some adjustments and also see the hand of God in it, because some years prior, there was quite a discussion going on called the Big Conversation in the UK, which was looking at the statistics and saying, look how the statistics are going. It's going right down, and within 10 or 20 years, there won't be any Christadelphians in the UK if we don't do something. Yeah, so that was the kind of talk that was going on at that time. Well, now God seems to have sent all these people that are very keen to learn the truth. And not only that, they're the age group that's missing. We need a lot more young brothers. They're missing. Yeah? There are young brothers, and they're working really, really hard because many of their peers went off to university and disappeared. So God is sending the age group that the ecclesias need to survive. And not only that, a lot of these young men that have come from Iran have already got wives and children back in Iran. So once they have their tribunal and they're allowed to stay, they can bring their immediate family.
So this work is not over yet?
No, Sunday schools that haven't been in operation for years are going to be resurrected with these little children that are keen to learn. So things are looking up, I would have said, for the ecclesias in the UK from that point of view. Definitely.
Yeah. It's an exciting story, isn't it? I mean, we wonder why our Lord hasn't returned. We often say, why hasn't our Lord returned yet? And then you see and hear of stories like this, and it answers that very question, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It was the same phenomenon, really, in East Europe, where we've been going for some time. Because, you know, in the 1960s and 70s, it was a Cold War, and everybody was terrified of Russia. They had their long-distance missiles focused on London and places like that, and we lived in fear of Russia. And the brothers and sisters, well, the brethren in those days used to give lectures on Sunday night saying how Russia's going to come down into Israel and destroy Israel, and then the Lord Jesus will come. And then suddenly, along came perestroika. The Russian communist system collapsed in 1989. The Berlin Wall fell down. And suddenly, Russia was no longer a world power threatening the UK. And for the first time, we were allowed to go into Russia or East Europe. Remember, Russia in those days encompassed Czechoslovakia, Poland, right across to Kazakhstan on the far side. What was Russia, we could now go into with a Bible. Because for 70 years after the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, nobody could dare go into Russia openly with Bibles. And some were smuggled in, of course, but nobody's allowed to read the Bible. It's unlawful. And now the doors opened. And of course, the people in those countries were dying to know about the Bible. They were so curious to find out what Western people believed. So when we went there, the doors was wide open for us. I first went to Prague in Czechoslovakia in 1993, which is about like 3 or 4 years after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And you could stand on the door at the entrance to the metro station, and you could give out 1,000 leaflets an hour. People just snatched them out of your hands. They were so keen to find out about what people believed out there in the West. So that's a great phenomenon, really. And so what seemed to be happening was that God was allowing a period for people from East Europe to become Christadelphians, to become brothers and sisters, to find out about Him and His Word, and to have the hope of the kingdom extended to them. And a little harvest was being reaped out there in East Europe during the next 20 or 30 years. And we can see now, 20 years later, as the level of interest is dying down, and that the harvest is coming to an end. But we now have something like, I suppose, 400 or 500 brothers and sisters out there who would never have been told about the Bible had it not been for perestroika, the end of the Soviet Union. And now we can see that Russia is getting strong again with all these military preparations and ships and aircraft and special drones and things, is becoming a threat to the West. And that's becoming more serious every day.
I'm interested in hearing a little bit more about some of your experiences in those areas. So you used to go out there quite often from the UK.
Yeah, we got into a routine of about four visits a year from about 1995 onwards. 1995, we went all around Ukraine for the first time. visiting contacts, and then from that year onwards, we did 4 or 5 trips a year, either to Ukraine, Kazakhstan, or Russia. And well, it was an experience, yes.
So when lockdown came, it all stopped. But in normal life, that's how many trips we would have been doing.
Of course, what we were surprised to find was that what we'd been told about Russia was actually not true. They had portrayed themselves as being a very strong and powerful nation. But actually, once you got away from the big cities into the country, and you visited our brothers and sisters, our new brothers and sisters, in their own houses, it was like going back in time. It was like going back 60 or 70 years. People were living in cottages with
no running water, a toilet down the bottom of the garden, just a hole in the ground, really. That's how they're living now.
Yeah, it's still like that now in the rural parts of Russia. Only the big cities like Moscow and Petersburg, where there's a more Western-type standard of living. Do you know, of all the brothers and sisters that we know in East Europe, and Kathryn and I, between us, are familiar probably with about 200 brothers and sisters, who we talk to or have talked to regularly before COVID. Of all those people, there's probably only a handful, one hand, have got a car.
Yeah, and
possesses a car.
It'll be an old Lada that is probably not very reliable and might break down as you're going along.
It won't be a new car. Yeah. Once you get into the EU, the standard of living comes up quite quickly.
Yeah.
But for most of our brothers and sisters, life is very hard, very hard. You understand, brother, if you get sick, you have to go to the doctors and you have to pay the doctor to see him. And if he sends you to the hospital, you have to pay for every day you're in hospital, you have to pay yourself. And if the doctor says you want some medicine, you have to pay for the medicine. Everything has to be paid for.
So there's no national health
service like we have here. So life is very hard. We've got old sisters in their 70s who are still having to work because otherwise they wouldn't have enough money to pay for their medicines, for example.
And that's quite normal in their culture. One of the big things that was a shock to me when I first went to East Europe amongst the people who were coming to learn about the Bible is how many came from broken families. It's really hard to find an intact family anywhere in society, of the ones we came across anyway. So people often came to us already divorced a few times, for instance. And we had children at the Bible school who were literally getting sort of juggled between 2 grandmas because the parents had broken up, neither of them wanted them, and so they would go between the 2 grandmas. And the granddads were long gone as well. So, the family situation I found really shocking. At the actual Bible schools that the CBM would hold, we would come together for a week and there would be a couple of different streams of studies. So there'd be a main study for all the people who were baptised, and then be a foundations group, which would be people from 13 upwards who weren't baptised, who were learning the basics of the first principles. And then you would have a children's class, which would be all the children up to 12. And then sometimes you would also have youth activities as well, a youth stream. And so for the average brother or sister, they would be in complete isolation from other brothers and sisters somewhere across Russia or Kazakhstan, and the CBM will pay for them to have an economy trip on the train or bus to get to Bible school, plus their accommodation and food while they're there. And they would need to pay a token amount, a small amount towards it, so it wasn't completely free for them. But for many of them, that would be their sort of once-a-year chance to see brothers and sisters for a whole week. And all the rest of the time through the year, they wouldn't see anyone face-to-face. So the lockdown has been interesting because a lot of people in places like England have realised that actually this is spiritual life for a lot of people in isolation. And, it's given us a taste of what that might be like. Obviously, we've got technology, so we can link up with people. But the CIL has been very good in sending out exhortations and studies every week by post to these brothers and sisters. So for years, they've been receiving these, and they would make their own breaking of bread at home on their own with their own emblems. And perhaps I'd have just an occasional phone call to another sister or brother and that would be about it. That would be their ecclesial life.
So you say they send stuff out by post?
Yes, we realised fairly early on, back in 1998, that sort of period, because these people are in isolation, they need to be fed. And so we have a system in the UK already existing called the Christadelphian Isolation League, which sends weekly exhortations in English to a circle of people all around the world, actually, who are in complete isolation but speak English.
On paper or on email? Or
on paper. So we got those translated into Russian. We have a team of translators who take these one a month each, and they translate it into Russian. And they also have a Bible study too. Every week they have a Bible study, which is translated into Russian. So those are posted to them. They get a month's worth at a time because of the postage cost. And that will take them with an exhortation based on the daily readings for that Sunday.
Yep.
Every Sunday all through a month. And the next month's come in and so on. So that's one thing we did right from very early on. And then we have a magazine, which is a Russian magazine, which is published by the Russian brothers and sisters themselves. And that comes out about 3 times a year.
Yep.
And then I realised fairly early on that these people will do the daily readings quite systematically. They follow the Bible reading calendar. They call it the Sputnik, by the way. The Sputnik goes around the world every year. So they all do the Sputnik, but they didn't really understand what they were reading. And they said, when you come from England and you stop with us for a week, we learn more in a week than we can find out in a year by ourselves. So I set myself the task, back in 10, 15 years ago now, to go through Bible books verse by verse, so that when they do the Bible readings, they can follow what the chapter is about, what it's telling them about. And that had to be translated into Russian, of course, by, we have a brother Dima, who's a brilliant translator. And so I've done books like Romans, Philippians, Peter, John's Gospel.
Building a library.
Isaiah, Jeremiah, Malachi, Esther. I've done about 10 different books so far, verse by verse, all the way through the book. And then it's been printed in Russian, and we post that out to every brother and sister in East Europe who needs these books. So that's been something we've been trying to do for about 15 years. The other thing we do, Brother, too, in 1998, again, quite early on, the Russian ruble collapsed because the economy, after the perestroika happened and all the USSR system ground to a halt, the economy just collapsed. And so we knew in that year our brothers and sisters were going to be really struggling just to feed themselves. And also the wheat harvest was very poor in that year too, which meant the price of bread would go up. So we decided, we set up a system, and we call it the Cherith parcel scheme. Cherith was the brook by which Elijah sat, and the birds brought to him through the air his bread and his food, fresh every day. So we call it the Cherith scheme. And through the post, we'll send these brothers and sisters 3 parcels a year, all through the winter, mainly in the winter. And in these parcels, we send them by parcel post, so they have to be fairly small packages. So in these parcels, we send them things like, for example, lentils, OXO cubes, vitamins, toothpaste, even soap, because for them, although they need them, they're quite expensive to buy. So things, it wasn't going to save their lives, these parcels. They weren't going to feed them for months, but at least they would know that somebody out there in England
someone cared
for them.
So you have a group of people that put these packages together?
Yes, we had, because we were sending out the magazines and things and exhortations to a vast number, something like 500 brothers and sisters in East Europe, we had their names and addresses. So we got the CIL printers to print out for us labels.
Yep.
And then we went to the English ecclesias and said, look, we'd like to have volunteers to send packages to East Europe. And the idea was, that one English family would look after one Russian family. And they keep on sending parcels to that same family. So they gradually build up a relationship with the people in that family. Yeah. That was the idea. And of course, eventually we got them to write letters to them as well. And because if you write a letter in English to some people in Russia, they normally have children at school who are learning English, or they can have a friend who speaks English and translate it for them. So that worked really, really well. So the brothers and sisters in England actually send the parcels out, and they pay for the contents themselves. We get the labels, and the instructions. And we have a list of things that we think they ought to send to make sure that generally the contents of the packets are reasonably similar in value.
Right.
So we don't get one brother in Russia saying, "Oh, I've just had a mobile phone." Somebody else, "Oh."
Yeah, someone's getting chocolate and someone's getting lentils.
We have to try and keep them more or less on the same level to avoid jealousies. That system's been going now for 22 years.
That's fantastic.
What that did actually was it helped brothers and sisters in the UK to feel useful because they felt they could send something to someone who would appreciate it and they could be involved on a more personal level. I think there's lots of people who think if I just put money in the collection, I don't know what happened to it and you know, I don't know where it went and all that. So this is a way for people to help more specifically if they wish to. And it always seemed to be about the right number of people wanting to help versus the number that needed it. It's worked out very, very well.
And how are things going over there now? I'm not speaking so much about COVID, but just generally.
It has to be said that the number of baptisms is dropping down now.
Yep.
You see, once the Russian people in East Europe got a taste of
everything in the world,
the Western people have, like flat screen televisions and
social media,
refrigerators,
all that,
and to be able to go to a supermarket and buy milk in a bottle or a plastic bottle, that was all new to them, and that's become their
normal now.
Normal, yes. They want to have these things, and so the emphasis is not so much on spiritual growth and understanding as materialism.
Yes.
So the attitudes have changed.
And that's what he was saying about the door closing, really.
Yeah, the door's closing.
The opportunity. Because once materialism came along, then there was many other things to distract people.
Once the people in charge in places like Kazakhstan and Russia got to know about Christadelphians, they realised these people were, to an extent, a threat to them. Because in Russia, it's the Orthodox Church is the one that Mr. Putin wants to be universal.
Well, he wants one church because he can control one church.
He doesn't want Protestants coming in and preaching a different kind of religion.
Yep.
And in Kazakhstan, for example, which is a Muslim type country, or at least over 50% of the population
Nominally
are Muslim, they don't want Christians.
Groups they don't know.
So our brothers and sisters in those countries, those two countries, live in fear because they are actually, our activities are really very often illegal. Ukraine's a little interesting because, of course, that wants to join the EU, and so it's much more liberal than Russia or Kazakhstan and the other countries on the east.
I suppose we should mention the brothers and sisters in Belarus as well, because at the moment they're in real fear because their country, you might say, is collapsing, their system. They have a dictator who's a good friend of Mr. Putin. So our brothers and sisters there, I would say nowadays, are quite in fear. When there used to be trips to Belarus, they used to not go with lots of literature, and they wouldn't go along in the car with a pile of literature in a box next to them, because if the policeman stopped them, then that could be real trouble.
Now that COVID has come, things have changed again, haven't they? How are you managing that?
It's affected them worse than it has us, of course, because the level of vaccination out there is very, very low.
Yes, they must pay for vaccination.
And we've lost brothers and sisters with the COVID virus.
I think the ones that live in little villages remotely, life probably continues as it always did. They are pretty much just in their own space anyway. But the ones in the big cities, the way their governments control them in lockdown is just turn off the public transport network, because most people don't have cars. So if they just turn the metro off and stop running all the buses, then people have to either stay home or walk. Economic reasons mean that they can't be in lockdown for very long, because most of them are just living day to day.
Right, those live a cash existence.
And one of the advantages of COVID has been that we've been able to keep in touch with them online with Zoom.
I was wondering whether most of them have access to technology.
Only a fraction.
And a small proportion actually have access to the internet. Because you see, it's not just having a mobile phone that can go on the internet. You have to pay for the data.
Yeah.
And to listen to an exhortation and Bible class for an hour, that's all money. So it's not so easy for them. But we have been able to have a weekly breaking of bread with our brothers and sisters in Ukraine and Kazakhstan, which is our particular responsibility for the CVM.
Yeah.
We've been able to have a weekly breaking bread with them since
more than a year now.
May last year, yeah.
But it's just a fraction of the people.
Yeah.
And, as with all ecclesias found, there was people who perhaps hadn't had technology before and didn't want it. So it's taken a while for some of them to get online and understand what they're doing. And next week, we're hoping to have the first online Bible school for the countries in East Europe. It will be in the Russian language, but this is the first attempt to do a Bible school of sorts. I mean, it's not the same as going in person.
Are they assembling at their local areas, or are they all just staying where they are?
In their own houses. And we understand some people can need to work or have childcare responsibilities or whatever. With the big time differences, some people will be starting in the middle of the day, others will be, almost at the end of the day when it's starting. So we're happy if people can just dip in and dip out, really. If they could do 1 hour a day, that would be fantastic, wouldn't it?
And you'll do it in Russian, or what language will you do it in?
It will be Russian, yeah.
Yes, that's been Russian. And we have the same streams that we had before. There'll be a children's classes, there'll be foundations classes for learners, there'll be the main studies for the brothers and sisters.
But it'll just be like one session a day, whereas in person it would have been all day for each stream.
At the Bible school, we would have had 3 translators in 3 different classes all going on simultaneously. But now, obviously, we can't do that online. So it'll be a reduced Bible school, but it's the best we can do because of COVID.
In some ways, it's been good because they've got the tools, they've got the assistance from a distance, but they need to be the ones doing the preaching.
David and Kathryn, it's been such a pleasure to speak to you. Well, this morning your time and this evening my time. It's been fantastic to get a bit of an update on what's happening with the UK. I found that really interesting, and also some of your stories about the preaching over in Russia over the last few years has been really inspiring. Thanks for joining Wilderness Conversations.
We've enjoyed chatting to you. It's been great.
Yeah.
Our love to all the brothers and sisters.